Welcome to the Virtual Center for the Study of the Constitution and Civic Responsibility, an ongoing inquiry into American political origins and evolving institutions. The Executive Director of the Virtual Center is Dr. Bill O'Brien. He's also your host for this continuing conversation. Here he is now, Dr. Bill O'Brien.
Thank you, Bob Kincaid, and welcome to the Virtual Center for the Study of the Constitution and Civic Responsibility on this absolutely gorgeous Monday. Today is the 13th day of April. I do believe that winter is behind us. I'm going to go out on a limb and say that. I think everybody I've been talking to this weekend, because of the wonderful weather, people have been working in their yards and picking up yard trash and just chatting across the street, and it's been absolutely delightful. This is really the first work weekend that we've had. Easter Sunday was good, but on the other hand, it was Easter Sunday, so there wasn't a whole lot of yard work going on that day. But this weekend was a little bit different. It was an absolutely beautiful weekend here in the mountains. I trust that your weekend was well also. I know that there were some storms and some serious tornado action in the Midwestern part of the country, but as a whole, I trust that the bulk of people's weather. I received an email from a friend in Connecticut this morning, and he made the point that, the snow has barely melted up there, and now the temperature, as he pointed out on Saturday, it was 68 degrees there. So I really do believe we're beyond it, and I get a sense that a lot of people feel like they have the enjoyment of the weather coming to them this year. For some reason, this winter seemed to take a little bit heavier toll on folks than maybe that's me. I know it did with me. I found this one to be particularly tough. But other people I've talked to have suggested that they felt the same way. So maybe it's not just me. Again, we are here on a Monday here at the Virtual Center. I look forward to this through much of the weekend. I do want to remind you that after today's program, beginning to tomorrow, we'll be running repeat programs for a while. I'll be leaving town early in the morning and heading to New England. As I mentioned, my wife's son is scheduled to be deployed around the 1st of May. We're not exactly sure what day. But sometime around the 1st of May, and his deployment is to extend for 2 years. Because he happens to be involved in nuclear submarines, we really don't have any idea where he'll be or where he's going. I'm not sure he does. And he has 3 little girls. The oldest one is 8. So that's going to be a little bit of a challenge for his wife. And for my wife, their grandmother. But we're looking forward to a good week. We're planning to stay up there. He has asked us to please see if we could extend our stay through next Sunday. So I'm guessing that we're probably going to have some sort of a farewell dinner or cookout or something on next Sunday. And we're planning to head back this way to the mountains early on Monday morning. We should be in sometime Monday evening next week, and we'll be back on the air here at the Virtual Center on Tuesday next week. So that means we'll be missing live programs tomorrow, Wednesday, and next Monday. Three programs. I look forward to Bob Kincaid's skill in pulling some what I believe are interesting, I hope are interesting programs to fill the void. I would like to think they won't be as interesting as they are when we're here live, but on the other hand, most of the ones that he's playing were recorded when we were here live. So I'm hoping that they do justice to the program and to Bob's network. I'm sure they will. We do invite you to participate in our program by letting us hear from you. Our phone number is area code 304-663-4676. That's 304-663-4676. And as we've mentioned numerous times, 4676 on your keypad translates into HORN, H-O-R-N. If you would like to communicate directly with me via email, I would love to hear from you. My email address is waobrien906@gmail.com. That's waobrien, O-B-R-I-E-N, 906@gmail.com. When we signed off last Wednesday, I was basically suggesting at the end of the program that in today's program, once we resume the first of this week, we would be picking up on the theme that we began last week, which is actually it's a book by Suzanne Mettler, who teaches government at Cornell University. And we had spent a little bit of time talking about a book that just came out recently. There's a lot of interest in the book. She's been on book notes on C-SPAN. She's been on a number of interview programs. There are reviews. I have gotten copies of reviews from the Washington Post, the New York Times, the Chronicle of Higher Education, and various other publications. So this is a fairly significant book, I think. The title of the book is Degrees of Inequality. And her focus, for the most part in this book, is higher education. And what she, of course, is suggesting is something that we've mentioned here numerous times at here at the Virtual Center. And I really believe that the point is significant. And I found it rather refreshing and encouraging to note that Suzanne Mettler focused her entire study, her 8 years of research on degrees of inequality, on this particular issue. And that issue, very, very specifically, is the seeming recent demise of higher education as the key ingredient in moving up the social ladder in today's society. She points out throughout the history of education in this country, education was always seen as a vehicle for opportunity. And she points out even in the middle of the 20th century, with the GI Bill in the late 40s, and the institution of Pell Grant system in the 1950s, where higher education was generously being subsidized by taxpayers, by the federal government. The basic idea being, of course, that it was in the public interest for the nation to make a serious substantive investment in the educational opportunities available to its young people, to the point that it was seen as a good investment to subsidize the efforts of those from families without any college experience or background at all. In fact, many of us, and I count myself in this group, many of us can claim that we are the first people in our families to ever have gone to college and hopefully graduated. And so much of this was the result of the GI Bill for returning veterans after World War II and for the program that we usually refer to as the Pell Grant system after former Senator Pell of Rhode Island. For the first time in American history, it appeared, for most people at least, that we were experiencing direct government subsidies for purposes of the masses. There always had been speculation and arguments about the fact that government was finding ways to subsidize the few and corporate America and various other groups. And there were serious questions raised periodically throughout history about whether, in fact, government even cared about, let alone could find some way to help out average citizens, the working poor, so to speak. These programs, which made higher education possible for people for whom it would be possible in no other way, these programs were documented evidence, clear evidence, in the minds of many people that government really had turned a corner and that we were serious as a nation about raising all boats, about finding ways to invest in the future of all of our citizens and allowing them to go as far as their talents and their abilities would take them. I know that was the way I went to school. That was the way many of my friends went to school. I'm guessing that it also is the way that many of those listening went to school as well. Suzanne Mettler's book, Degrees of Inequality, is suggesting that beginning in the 1980s with the election of Ronald Reagan, all of that began to change. And for the last 35 years, since the early 80s, government's willingness to invest in the future of its young people by subsidizing higher education has experienced a major reductions. Consequently, as a result of that, as subsidies, government subsidies, both federal and state, began to shrink, that meant that the burden, the cost of higher education, increasingly fell on the student himself or herself, the student and family, in other words. The result of this is that students began to incur higher and higher debt as they began to graduate from college, for those that finished, with a substantial debt, which has grown increasingly in recent years. Today, we've reached the point, of course, where there are articles and serious position papers out there suggesting whether the increased cost of college is even worth it. And the assertions by many people, many reputable people, that college is not necessary for everybody, that there are some people that really would be wasting their time going to college, and in fact, that society would be better if they didn't go to college. We need skilled workers, we need skills in the trades, we need all sorts of things that don't require 4-year college degrees, and of course, with this came the tremendous increase in the growth of community colleges as a result. Anyway, the theme of Suzanne Mettler's book, Degrees of Inequality, is that this tremendous shrinkage in the support for higher education, government support for higher education, has effectively sabotaged and undone an important part of the American dream. It has basically taken higher education as vehicle for social improvement, for social mobility, and reduced it instead to higher education as an affirmation, if you will, of inequality in society. That as college once again has become something that only the few can afford, what we look at are the graduation results, and we begin to find indeed that the vast bulk of those graduating from college in recent years are sons and daughters of the wealthy, and the graduation rates among working and middle-class citizens have dropped markedly. Consequently, a college degree has ceased to be, and this is Suzanne Mettler's thesis, a college degree has ceased to be the basis for economic opportunity in America, and instead has become an affirmation of the inequality and lack of opportunity that seems to be taking hold here in America. And she feels that this is extremely dangerous. It's extremely bad for the nation, and it is being reflected in much of the data that she has looked at over the 8 years that she has spent poring over this subject in preparation for this book. Suzanne Mettler wrote a book that was published several years ago, 2006, entitled The Submerged State. And in that book, she addressed in a more general way the issue of government subsidies, of direct government aid to citizen programs, social programs. Basically, what she took on, of course, is the claim of prominent political leaders in this country that support the idea of small government. You know, the Jefferson's old idea that the government governs best, which governs least. And what she points out is this idea of small government as a way to promote and expand individual freedom in America has taken hold. And of course, we know that the right in this nation has focused on this particular issue more and more all the time. In other words, their commitment to reduce government, reduce the size and the cost of government, reduce government involvement in people's lives, reduce the degree of government regulation over corporate America and small business and all of these other things. In other words, the basic litany that comes out of the right is that all these good things that we look forward to in America, like economic growth and job expansion and opportunities and all the rest of it, are being hampered by the fact that our government is too big, it's too expensive, it's too intrusive, it's too regulatory, and it needs to be whittled down to size. And of course, as we know, in the last couple of weeks, we've been focusing here on the move towards an Article 5 convention with the announced idea of adopting an amendment, a balanced budget amendment. So clearly the balanced budget amendment is a classic statement, it seems to me, of the effort to whittle down from big government and whittle it down to size, so to speak, by denying it the revenue that it needs to be so intrusive, to be so all-encompassing, and all the rest of it. On Wednesday, when we left our program here at the Virtual Center, we talked about coming back to or revisiting that topic, and I would like to do that for a good portion of our program today. But over the weekend, the New York Times ran an obituary of one of the most significant, important, and finest American historians to come down the pike in a long time. And that is Professor Stanley Cutler, who was a history of American constitutional history and professor of constitutional law at the University of Wisconsin. Stanley held, until he retired several years ago, Stanley Cutler held a joint appointment at the University of Wisconsin in the history department and in the law school. Stanley was the E. Gordon Fox Professor of American Institutions in the Department of History and the School of Law at the University of Wisconsin. He edited a series called The American Moment for Johns Hopkins, and he is probably most known by most people because it was through his suit and his efforts that the Nixon tapes, the Watergate tapes, were released. And in fact, Stanley Cutler published many of these tapes when they first came out in his book entitled The Wars of Watergate. I was very privileged to have been a student in Stanley Cutler's constitutional history class at the University of Wisconsin. And at that time, when I took the class, and it would have been fall of 67, spring semester of 68, at the time I was taking the class, I realized, and I can remember telling people, that this might be one of the finest courses in American history that I had ever taken in my life. I felt like I learned more in Stanley Cutler's classes, 2-semester class, than I learned probably anywhere else. In my second year in graduate school, I roomed with 3 other graduate students. 4 of us got a garden apartment together. And one of my roommates was a major under Stanley Cutler. He was a constitutional historian. He was pursuing a degree in constitutional history under the tutelage of Stanley Cutler. At the time, as I've mentioned many times, I was enrolled under Professor Merrill Jensen, and I was pursuing a degree in the American Constitution and American Revolution and Constitution, a more traditional American history degree. It stands to reason that in the degree that I was pursuing, my advisor, Professor Jensen, made it a point to encourage as many of his graduate students as he could get to do it to take Stanley Cutler's course. And, basically I can remember Professor Jensen telling me that you cannot leave this institution with a graduate degree on the American Constitution and not have taken American constitutional history from Stanley Cutler. That was in the 1960s. When I left the University of Wisconsin and came to West Virginia in 1971, I naturally assumed that I'd probably never see or hear from again Stanley Cutler. But things have a way of happening. One of the things that happened, which kind of kept me in touch rather indirectly with Stanley Cutler, was that for a long time I maintained contact with that former roommate of mine who was a major who got his degree under Stanley Cutler and was teaching in the University of California system. He has become one of the most noted constitutional historians in the country. Right now his name is Michael Belknap. And last I heard he was teaching at the University of California in Northridge. I can remember the year that we roomed together, hearing stories about what it might have been like to be a major under Professor Stanley Cutler. But I had my own stories about what it was like to be a Jensen student in one of Stanley Cutler's classes. I've thought this weekend as I saw the obituary in the New York Times, I spent the weekend going back and reflecting on a lot of these things. And some of them I remember so very well. When I went into Professor Cutler's class, fall semester 1966 it was, 66 fall, 67 spring. It was my second year at the university. I was a second year graduate student. And it was what they called a cross-listed class, which meant it was a class with a 500 number on it. It was 500 and something. And what a 500 class meant was that both undergraduate and graduate students could enroll for the class. The difference was that while the basic class was the same for everybody, graduate students were usually given different research requirements than were the undergraduates. And whereas the undergraduate students would have their discussion sections with graduate teaching assistants, the graduate students in a 500 level class would meet directly with the professor of record. That meant that not only did we have Dr. Cutler for 3 lectures a week, but we also had discussion sections with Dr. Cutler as well. So I got to know him pretty well in the course of that year. Anyway, the very first meeting of the class, when he's explaining the syllabus and going over what the requirements will be and how many exams there will be and what kind of research requirements there will be and all of that, of course, he made it a point to emphasize that this was a graduate class in American constitutional history and that meant that there was going to be research involved. We were going to be reading Supreme Court cases like we had never read them before. There's absolutely no question that whatever background I can lay claim to in the more legal side of the Constitution, I owe pretty much to this particular experience. I can remember when Professor Cutler talked about the research requirements for graduate students in that class. There were probably 75 or 80 students in the lecture hall. It was a fairly large group. And he had gone over the syllabus and explained what undergraduates were going to be required to do. And then he turned to the graduate students and he asked for a show of hands as to how many graduate students there were in the group. And I would guess, as I remember just show of hands at the time, it was better than a third. I would say probably 60%, 65% of the students enrolled were undergraduates and 35% graduate students. So there was a significant number of us, I would say. Anyway, what he was talking about was the fact that by the time we met for the second class in 2 days, we would come with 3x5 cards with research topics on it. He wanted us to spend time between the first class and the second selecting a research topic for the semester. And he gave us a list of possible options. It was an extensive list. But since most of us had not taken the course ever, the list was, it might as well been in a foreign language because most of us were totally unfamiliar with the topics. So that meant that if we were going to select a topic, many of us had to get busy and find out what some of these things even were about before we could decide whether we wanted to do it. So after he went down the list and took questions and answers and answered a number of questions from graduate students about the assignment, the requirement, he kind of paused and said how much he really enjoyed teaching this class. This was his favorite class because these weren't going to be prospective lawyers. Many of them might end up to be lawyers, but at least at this point in their graduate career, law school was not in the offing. And he talked about how difficult it was to teach a room full of prospective lawyers. And I can remember one of the things he talked about was the fact that the one thing that seemed to define law students, no matter where they came from, was the desire to hear themselves talk. And he used to talk about how difficult it was for him to get a word in edgewise in classes with law students. But then he again returned to this and he said this particular class he loved the best because this was, we were all raw. And I remember him using that word. We were raw. And we didn't really know enough to cause questions or to take the floor or sound off or pontificate or assert ourselves on particular issues. And he liked that. And then he said, one of the special benefits and one of the things I like best about teaching this class is every once in a while I get a Jensen student enrolled in it. And of course that was me. And he said, I want everybody to know we have a Merrill Jensen student in the classroom. And then he pointed to me and asked if I'd stand up. And I did. I was dreading that he'd ask me something, but I stood up. And he said, ignore everything that I've said about the research assignment for graduate students, Mr. O'Brien. I want you to come up at the end of class and I will give you your assignment. And I thought, the first thing I thought of, my God, there must be some sort of collusion between Jensen and Cutler. And Jensen must be behind this. But anyway, so I kind of sweated it out a little bit for the rest of the class. But when it ended and everybody was leaving, I rather hesitantly made my way to the front of the lecture hall. And he was talking to a few other students and doing a little paperwork and stuff. And then this big smile came across his face. And he said, O'Brien, we're going to have fun. And I said, I hope so. But I didn't believe it. And he said, most of the students that are doing research for this class are going to be going out and collecting information on a particular subject. There's been an issue that has dogged me for years, and I've always wanted the opportunity to conduct some research on it. And I made up my mind that the next Jensen student that I get in my constitutional history class, I'm going to assign this topic to them. And you happen to be the one. And he said, how much do you know about ratification of the Constitution? And I said, Professor Cutler, not a whole lot. But you need to understand this. This is the beginning of my second year. I mean, I've only been here 1 year. And he said, oh, I know that. But he said, your 1 year, given the fact that it was spent with Merrill Jensen, is probably equates to everybody else's first 2 years. He said, well, let me tell you a little bit about ratification of the Constitution. He said, I'll bet you didn't know that there were 3 states of the original 13, 3 of them, Connecticut, South Carolina, and Georgia, that didn't ratify the Constitution until the 1930s. Your research assignment is to tell me why. And the first thing I thought of is, how do you prove a negative? How do you go out and find out why somebody didn't do something? And I became quite agitated about this. Of course, the one advantage I had over the other students is I didn't have to spend any time over the next 2 days researching my topic. I already knew what I had. So the question then is, why did 3 states not ratify the Constitution when the states were ratifying the Constitution? And of course, the first answer, the most obvious answer comes to mind, is that once you reached the magic number 9, once 9 states ratified, it really wasn't necessary. It became the law of the land, so automatically the Constitution was in effect whether the rest of the states ratified it or not. Problem was that even though 9 states had ratified, until you got New York and Virginia, the Union didn't have a chance. Madison and Hamilton knew that 9 states was meaningless unless Virginia and New York were included among the 9. So consequently, the biggest battles at the end of the ratification struggle were in Virginia in June of '88, and then in New York later that summer. And of course, it was in the Battle of New York after Virginia finally ratified in late June. Madison made his way to New York and joined Hamilton in the writing of the Federalist Papers, which began in late 1787 and went all the way into the summer of 1788. So that was the most obvious reason that states didn't ratify, because they didn't really have to. But I didn't think I could get away with saying that. That's kind of like the old, just say, what was the reason for such and such, and put down one word, because, I thought if I hand in a short paragraph like that and say the reason they didn't ratify because they didn't have to, the Constitution went into effect when 9 states ratified, that was it, end of story. But the more I thought about it, the more I realized that in order to answer this question, to meet this challenge, I had to know what was happening in each of those 3 states during the period of ratification. In other words, I had to do some research in ratification itself during the period of the 1780s. Then I had to basically do some research in those 3 states in the 1930s in order to find out if they didn't ratify earlier, why did they suddenly change their mind in the 1930s? And that meant that I had 6 associated research projects, 3 states in the late 1780s and 3 states in the 1930s. And what I would have to do is tell the story in each of these in order to explain. I learned more doing that assignment than I can't even imagine. I can't even begin to explain how much I learned. At first, I thought it was unfair. I thought I was being singled out and given an assignment which was not equal to everybody else. That I thought that he was coming down a little bit harder on me because I was a Jensen student. But in the course of doing this paper, I became absolutely enthralled with Stanley Cutler. His class, every one of his lectures was a gem. And probably more than anything else, the reason that his lectures were gems is because he got so damn excited about what he was talking about. He loved his subject. He loved the founders. He loved the Constitution. He loved John Marshall. He loved Roger B. Taney. He loved the Supreme Court. He absolutely worshiped the Constitution of the United States. And it came out. And I basically learned more in that class. I'm not going to say than I did in any other course ever, because I've been very fortunate. Not only did I have Stanley Cutler, but I obviously had Merrill Jensen. And I had history. I was a graduate teaching assistant for a history of education professor named Jürgen Herbst, who passed away just 2 years ago. And I probably learned more about teaching from Jürgen Herbst than anybody else ever could anywhere. I mean, this man was an absolute genius when it came to teaching. And the respect that he had for scholarship, and the respect that he had for students, and the way he was able to convince every student that they were capable of unbelievable things if they just put their mind to it and made up their mind to do it and do it well, and to seek the advice and the counsel of people that could help them. He was one of the most incredibly creative, good people I'd ever met in my life. So I can't say Stanley was absolutely the best, but definitely he was one of my top 3 But as I mentioned before, when I left the University of Wisconsin in 1971 and came to West Virginia, I really thought that my contact with Stanley Cutler was at an end. As I mentioned, I maintained contact with Mike Belknap out in California. At that time, we weren't emails, but we used to, there was no cell phones or anything like that, but we used to write letters to each other and that kind of thing. Occasionally, just, what are you doing? How's it going? Blah, 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 all that. And he would tell me a few things about Cutler, because he maintained him. He worked with Professor Cutler to publish his dissertation, and Mike has published a number of things since then. And Cutler, in credit to Mike Belknap, Cutler told me more than one occasion that Mike Belknap, in many ways, was the best graduate student he ever had as a major. And the reason he said it is, Mike Belknap worked harder than any graduate student I've ever had. He would do anything to be a little bit better than average. And he said, basically, I don't know what I can say about Mike's innate abilities, but his willingness to work and put his shoulder to the grindstone, that kind of thing. Stanley used to admire Mike Belknap so much for the degree of work. Mike used to work all the time. I roomed with him for a year. He studied a lot. He was a good graduate, very serious graduate student, a good graduate student. Of course, his dad was a professor at Northridge, and it kind of went in the family. He felt like he had he had a family heritage to uphold, and he worked very hard to do it. But other than that, I didn't really maintain any contact with Stanley Cutler until 2003. In 2002, I wrote a grant for the Department of Education on using primary sources on the founders. And I was fortunate enough that it was funded. And in the course of that, what I laid out over the 3-year life of the grant was a series of 3 summer academies in which teachers enrolled in the grant would come to campus here in southern West Virginia and be housed in the dorms for a period of, the first year it was 5 weeks of the summer. But once I talked to teachers and began to realize 5 weeks out of the summer was a particularly big commitment to ask of teachers. Many of them had kids and families and that kind of stuff. Asking them for 5 weeks was a little bit much. So the second year we cut it down to 3, and the third year we cut it down to 2. But what we did was basically begin programming at 8 o'clock in the morning, and we ended at 9:15, 9 o'clock, 9:30 at night. Obviously, the teachers lived at home on weekends. We did not have grant programs on Fridays, which meant that our work week was Monday through Thursday, 8 a.m. to 9 p.m. During those days when teachers were living on campus, we fed them well. We fed them with sit-down dinners. We had, steak and roast beef and all of that. We fed them really well. We treated our teachers like I believe teachers always should have been treated, like professionals, like the important professionals that they are. And I think they really appreciated it. And what we did is we brought in guest lecturers as we walked our way through American history. The first week was devoted to the founding, to the colonial period and the founding. For that, we brought in what I believe is the number one colonialist in the country today, who's Bob Bliss. Bob is the dean at the Laclede Honors College at the University of Missouri in St. Louis. So Bob came in the first week. And then John Kaminsky would come in when we got into the Constitution and the early national period under the Washington administration, the struggles between Jefferson and Hamilton and all the rest of it. For that, we brought in John Kaminsky. For the Jackson period, the controversy over the constitutional history of the 19th century, namely the significance of the Marshall Court, the transition to the Taney Court, and the role that the Supreme Court and interpretation of the Constitution played in understanding Reconstruction after the Civil War. I contacted Stanley Cutler. It had been 30 years since we had touched base. Stanley made it feel like it was 30 minutes. I can remember talking to him on the phone and saying, Professor Cutler, I know there's no way in the world you can remember who I am, but he remembered everything. He remembered the Jensen story. He remembered the research assignment I had done in 1967. He remembered everything. And he said that he would be honored to come in and participate in this grant because he loved to teach teachers. So Stanley came in for, I believe, 3 or 4 days, and absolutely wowed the teachers on Reconstruction, on Charles River. And I had asked him, I said, the Charles River Bridge, you got to do that. That book is absolutely astounding. It's one of the most meaningful books I'd ever read. And Stanley said, we'll make sure we do a session on Charles River Bridge, and he did. Did a session on Reconstruction. He did a session on John Marshall and Roger B. Taney and the perceived differences between the two courts. And then he began to look at cases that they had decided. And his basic argument is that there really wasn't the degree of difference between John Marshall and Roger B. Taney that historians have tended to make out that there was. And teachers absolutely fell in love with Stanley Cutler. By that time, Stanley was 70 years old. But he was vibrant. He was still vibrant. And he was exciting in class. And he loved the material. He would get so excited when he got up before students talking about this stuff. And I can remember the teachers would tell him, you got to sit 3 rows back because he gets so excited. Saliva flies out of his mouth when he's talking. He gets so excited. And they just love him. He came to dinner with us at night. He sat and had dinner with us in the evening. And then after dinner, we would have a round table. We had about 35 teachers at them. We would have, take chairs and sit all the way around the room, and Stanley would just hold court, and we would have these open discussions. Some of the most exciting, enlightening scholarship and educational experiences I've ever had in my life are associated with Stanley Cutler. When I saw this weekend that he had passed away, I never believed that Stanley Cutler would ever pay, if that makes sense, that Stanley, it seemed to me he'd always been there and he always needed to be there. But I think all of us, and I'm beginning to experience this as well, and I've heard people say this before, I never really understood what they meant until it began to happen to me. But there basically comes a time, I think, for all of us when we, to use an expression, we tend to outlive our friends, all of our friends. And I felt like I lost a great one in the last few days. As I mentioned, I'm very, very lucky on my bookshelves. I'm staring at them right now. I have The Wars of Watergate. I have The American Inquisition, Stanley Cutler's book on McCarthyism. And then on my desk right here, I have a copy of Privilege and Creative Destruction, the Charles River Bridge case, with the personal note from Stanley Cutler. I'd like to make you aware, I mean, we've done this before. I think we've spent a whole session here on the Virtual Center some time ago on Charles River Bridge when we were focusing principally on the court, on the Marshall Court and some of the major decisions. Since we've gotten into the Federalist Papers in recent months, we've gotten away from that. But if you remember, we were focusing principally on the courts when we were looking at things like Citizens United and looking at the role of the courts and dissenting opinions and things like that. When Justice Roger B. Taney rendered the court's decision in 1837 in the case of Charles River Bridge versus Warren Bridge, it became, and this is what Stanley Cutler's book is about, it became, in so many ways, one of the most important decisions that the Supreme Court had ever reached for a number of reasons. One of them, and this was astounding to me, but as I look at it, I can see where he's coming from. One of the things that we noticed, I think we made mention of this here at the Virtual Center about John Marshall. John Marshall was almost never, only one time was he on the losing end of a decision while he was Chief Justice. During the entire tenure of Marshall, which was 1803 all the way up until he died in 1836, the court had not experienced or begun the tradition of dissenting opinions. Most of the decisions of the court were unanimous decisions. And under Marshall, most of them were written by Marshall. When people refer to it as the Marshall Court, they're not kidding. He was the dominant figure on that court. And he had some back and forth and some pronounced disagreements with individual members of the court. But generally speaking, the court decisions under Marshall were overwhelming. You didn't have these 5-4 decisions or anything like we have as a regular practice today. Charles River Bridge broke that tradition. For the first time in Charles River Bridge, there was a real, meaningful, viable split on the court over that decision between conservatives and what we would call today liberals. I don't know what they called them then, because Roger B. Taney was not a liberal. Roger B. Taney was Chief Justice of the Supreme Court that issued the Dred Scott decision in 1857. So we're not talking about liberals here in the modern sense. But what we are talking about is the perception or the role envisioned for government in this free society, this so-called free enterprise society that we have. And at that time, on the court, at the time that the decision in Charles River Bridge was rendered, there was a significant split on the court between those who believed that government needed to be as small and unobtrusive and as invisible as possible, and that the more active government became, the more threatened individual freedom became. The member of the court, probably the spokesman for this group, was Justice Joseph Story, S-T-O-R-Y. Taney, as Chief Justice, was spokesman for the other perspective, which was that what sustains the Union, what sustains the nation, what sustains economic opportunity and growth in this nation is a government and a government's willingness to manage the economy, manage growth, and deal with change, deal constructively with change. In other words, Tawney would probably be, if we asked him today, he would probably endorse the idea of the living Constitution, recognizing that if the Constitution didn't change, it could not survive. And the Charles River Bridge decision was an example of that kind of change. Basically, it was very, very simple. In fact, let me show you how simple it is by reading a paragraph from the back of Stanley Cutler's book. This is written from Sidney Nathans, and this appeared in the Journal of American History. In this now classic work in legal and constitutional theory, Stanley I. Cutler examines one of the Supreme Court's most celebrated decisions. In 1837, the court ruled that the state of Massachusetts had the right to erect a free bridge over the Charles River, even though it had previously chartered a privately owned toll bridge at the same location. The court's decision fostered the idea of creative destruction, a process that encourages new forms of property at the expense of older ones. Exploring the origins, context, and impact of this decision, Cutler integrates traditional American constitutional history with a new legal history that emphasizes the social and economic bases of legal change. This case, Stanley Cutler argues in his lucid little book, was more than a local dispute between a Boston corporation and the state of Massachusetts over how many bridges should span the Charles River, a conflict the Supreme Court resolved in 1837. Rather, said Cutler, it was a landmark instance of creative destruction by the judiciary, whereby the court permitted new community needs to supersede anachronistic property rights. Cutler's book is exemplary. Unquote. That was in a review in the Journal of Southern History. That's the case. Very simple. In order to get a bridge, in order to persuade or lure or entice private investors, in this case Harvard University, to construct a bridge across the Charles River in the late 18th century, in the 1780s, the state of Massachusetts granted the company which agreed to build the bridge a monopoly for its toll bridge. The company that built it insisted that it be a toll bridge, and that the company could continue to collect tolls every time somebody went back and forth across the bridge. The state of Massachusetts granted that monopoly because the state of Massachusetts recognized that the lack of a bridge was inhibiting economic growth and inhibiting opportunity in the Boston area. The only way to promote economic expansion and economic growth was to do everything possible to increase the flow of traffic from Charlestown to Boston across the Charles River. And the only way you could do that, there were ferries, but any of you who've taken a ferry knows that they while they're scenic, they're very slow and inefficient. The state realized that to construct a bridge and expedite the flow of traffic back and forth across that bridge would be in the public interest. It would benefit the whole area and all the citizens in it. So consequently, the state of Massachusetts entered into a contract with the Warren Bridge Company to build a toll bridge. Under the Constitution of the United States, Article 10, the contract clause, this company had a contract with the state of Massachusetts promising its exclusive rights to collect tolls on this bridge. That contract, in effect, was property to the company. It was a piece of paper that the company could take to the bank because it was a guarantee from the state of Massachusetts guaranteeing that monopoly, that right. Fast forward to the 1830s. Fast forward to the Boston area in the 1830s. The bridge had been so successful, economic growth in the area had been so dramatic, that the area was demanding another bridge. And the Charles River Bridge Company came forward and offered to build that bridge. The difference was, between the first bridge and the second bridge, the difference was that the company insisted that the bridge be a toll bridge only until the cost of construction was paid. Once the company had been reimbursed for the cost of building the bridge, then the tolls would come off and it would be a free bridge. The first bridge company, Warren Bridge, obviously sued Charles River Bridge Company and went to court claiming under the Constitution of the United States that their contract rights and property rights had been violated were being violated by the state of Massachusetts in giving the go-ahead to Charles River Bridge Company to build this second bridge. So under property and contract, the case seemed to be a slam dunk, as it were. In 1837, Chief Justice Taney issued the decision of a split court, of a divided court. And in that decision, Justice Taney introduced the concept of creative destruction, which Stanley Cutler used in part as title for his book, Privilege and Creative Destruction. And his basic argument is that in an economic growth situation, oftentimes it's going to be necessary to replace old forms of property with new forms of property. The public interest in the 1780s had been to build a bridge. But by the 1830s, limiting the traffic across the Charles River to that one bridge was inhibiting economic growth, was inhibiting further expansion. Consequently, the public interest at that time demanded a second bridge. And the state of Massachusetts, believing that its principal responsibility was to promote the public interest, not honor ancient contracts, as it were, went along with the Charles River Bridge Company request. And Justice Taney and the Supreme Court endorsed that in the case of Charles River Bridge versus Warren Bridge in 1837. And I realize we've gone beyond. We'll take a break in a moment, but let me bring this to a close. I wanted to read a paragraph from Stanley Cutler's book on this decision. This is from his book, page 162, 163. Actually, I don't mean that. I had mismarked. This is from page 85 in Cutler's book, chapter 7. And this is what Cutler says about Justice Taney's decision in Charles River Bridge. Chief Justice Taney's opinion for the court combined specific legal principles with emerging general concepts involving the role of government and the public interest. He applied these specific principles and general concepts in order to serve particular purposes of the society and the economy. He utilized the law as a handmaiden for change, progress, and growth. As a specimen of judicial craftsmanship, Taney's opinion was of the highest caliber, dexterously joining stare decisis to a recognition of changes in American life that demanded legal accommodation. Actually, Taney offered little that was doctrinally new. He fashioned his views from early state court decisions, an English precedent, opinions by John Marshall and his colleagues, and the arguments of counsel. Taney's opinion marked not the emergence of a new idea, but rather the triumph of a competing idea now propelled by a decisive political and judicial majority. This decision, according to Stanley Cutler, began a new day in the perceived relationship between government and the economy, government and economic growth. In effect, what the Taney court was doing was affirming a role for government that was defined in the early 1790s by Alexander Hamilton in his economic program. It was a position that was articulated during the campaign of 1824 by John Quincy Adams. When John Quincy Adams was elected president in his inaugural address in 1824, he talked about the role of government in order to promote science, to promote invention, to promote discovery, to patent inventions, to support the arts, to support music and culture and literature. In other words, John Quincy Adams saw government's role as the driver of economic expansion and growth and the creator of opportunity. The reason I say all of this is because we are at the beginning of yet another presidential campaign in which the same issue is on the table again. And what Stanley Cutler did in Charles River Bridge is point out the point at which the Supreme Court became a player and a partner in this definition of government's role. Obviously, there was a significant opposition on the court, headed by Justice Story. Justice Story would be the early 19th century equivalent of Antonin Scalia in some respects, in the way they viewed the Constitution and the way they viewed the role of government. I guess what I would say in conclusion, it's 8 minutes after the hour, so I think I've probably given this not more than it warranted, but more than I should have. But I hope, in some small way, I have been able to demonstrate in the last hour and 10 minutes, if you will, the significant loss that all of us experienced this weekend. With that, I'd like to pause and take a short break, and then I'll come back and for the last 40 minutes of our program, I'd like to get back to Suzanne Mettler's idea of the submerged state, because I think this is a very, very significant concept. And since we're not going to be doing live programs for the next week, I'd like to leave the virtual center something substantive to chew on for a while. I think I can do that. I hope that you'll stay with us. This is Bill O'Brien at the Virtual Center. We're at 10 minutes after the hour. We'll pause for 5 minutes, then we'll come back and we'll complete our program here at the Virtual Center for the Study of the Constitution and Civic Responsibility. Please stay with us. We'll be right back. Thank you, Bob Kincaid, and thank you for the music. It was delightful, and it seemed to me so appropriate, at least in the mood that I'm in. I thought
it was. I thought it was, Dr. Bill, and in point of fact, that's Charlie Hayden and Pat Metheny from an album called Beyond the Missouri Sky, and the title of the track is He's Gone Away.
Oh, well, thank you, Bob. It seemed perfect. It just seemed wonderful, and I thank you so much.
Just so you'll know, during that, gosh, I think it was that first Prism summer when you had Stanley Cutler here, late in the evening after the day he had lectured, you, I, Dr. Cutler, and Ferg, who was much younger then than he is now,
right,
sat down at Outback.
I remember that. I had forgotten that. Yes.
And you, Stanley, and I all had a beer, and Ferg sat enwrapped listening to Dr. Cutler and asked a couple of questions. And I remember as I walked away, Stanley said, "You got a smart boy there. He'll do well." Yeah. Yeah. He was a brilliant man, but a genial man as well.
Oh, very easy to know and like. Yeah, I thought so. I don't know if you remember one of our teachers in that group was Betty Hara.
Yes.
And Betty was crazy about him. I don't even know if she knows that he passed away. Betty, of course, Betty's brother was one of the 29 miners killed at the UB disaster in 2010.
Oh my goodness, I didn't realize that.
Yeah. Her brother Stevie, her younger brother Stevie was one of the 29.
And of course, the Blankenship trial is at least scheduled to open a week from today.
Yeah. Well, no, they got it postponed to July 13th.
Did they? Did they?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, it was. They postponed. The judge postponed it to July 13th. But I always remember Betty because she used to say all the time, "Is Stanley going to come back? Is Stanley going to come back?" You know, I mean, she just thought he was wonderful. I mean, he was 70 years old, but my God, he was so vibrant and so alive. And
well, I think back to what kind of, I don't think there's any other word than chutzpah to describe one's willingness to take on the entire establishment structure to get them to turn loose of those Nixon tapes.
That's right. And he kept fighting when they if you remember, initially they only released about 100 so letters or pieces of evidence, and they redacted more than 300, and he kept fighting and fighting until he got all of them out. And once they all came out, Nixon was doomed. Nixon was doomed because he was a crook. In spite of the fact he said he wasn't, he was.
Well, he was, and I think it must forever be noted that Stanley Cutler was the one who helped us figure that out.
Yep. Yeah, he did. He did. I think there were so many things about Stanley. He wrote a play on Nixon, and in fact, he said, I was reading a quote in his obituary in the New York Times. Apparently, in an interview, he made the comment and said, "I hate to admit it, but it seems that my legacy is somehow going to be intertwined with Dick Nixon's." And I can see him saying that, if that makes sense, So, anyway, thank you, Bob. Thank you for everything.
My pleasure.
It was great. It was great. Thank you.
All right.
We are at we're at 18 minutes after the hour. We've got about a half an hour, and I think it's time. I don't know whether it's time to provide all of the supporting evidence that I might have, but I think it's time to lay out the thesis and provide a few examples, which I think will give those of you listening enough to chew on and recognize the significance. I think that a scholar to be reckoned with in this nation is going to be Suzanne Mettler. I saw her interviewed on her book, Degrees of Equality, on Book Notes, and she makes a few points, and she's obviously, she's a scholar, and she's obviously not dynamic in her presentation or anything like that, but her research is incredibly precise and incredibly sound. She doesn't make assertions wildly or blindly. She's got evidence for it. And I think the combination of the two books, the first one called The Submerged State, and the most recent one called Degrees of Inequality, what she's talking about is the somewhat invisible role that government in our society plays in providing assistance to citizens. And what she indicates is this is not an accident. This indeed, when it's all put together, becomes a strategy. And let me indicate what I'm talking about here. This is what got me going on this topic. I read a piece, actually it was dated the 31st of March. So I've had this piece for a couple of weeks now, but I've spent quite a bit of time on that, pursuing Suzanne Mettler and looking at some of Suzanne Mettler's research. And I read an article that she had written in, I believe, the Washington Post on this topic. So I've been doing a lot of research since I first came across this. But let me tell you what really grabbed my attention. And I don't know about you, but there are certain things that happen in our society that we do without question because they've always been done. You know, it seems like it's always been that way, so nobody ever asks why we do that. Because usually the answer you get is, what do you mean, why do we do it? We've always done it. And there are some things that occasionally, in my mind, I've raised a question as to wonder why we do that. One of them is healthcare. And specifically, this is the issue that for a long time has kind of intrigued me. Where did this idea come that employers provide health care? I know it's always true. I remember when I got my first job, when I graduated from high school in a paper mill. It included health care. It was so much per hour plus benefits. At that time, I was 17 years old. Benefits didn't mean a whole heck of a lot to me. Now they do, and I think more and more, given the battles we've had in recent years over the issue of health care, I think the idea of fringe benefits means everything. Because one of the things we've seen in this society in recent years is a decline in those jobs that come with fringe benefits, with health care. So then the question became, where did this come from? And I've heard employers make the same statement and say, where is it written that part of my job starting a company is to provide health care for my employees? What about the responsibility of employees to provide for their own health care? And it's hard to refute that except to say, well, employers have always done that, but they haven't. So in reading this piece from 2 weeks ago, what grabbed my attention initially was the answer to this question. I think it says a lot. As part of the Reagan Revolution in the 1980s, Senator Robert Packwood, Bob Packwood, many of you will remember him. He was chairman of the Senate's Finance Committee in the Reagan administration. And he defended the principle of employer-provided health insurance being tax-free. He believed that government had a responsibility to support employers who were providing health care to their employees by making it unnecessary for the employer to pay any taxes on this. And what Packwood said during this period in defense of that was that this concept, this idea of employers paying health care and government not taxing that on the part of employers has benefits that go way beyond health care. Specifically, it prevents government from getting too big. And this becomes linked with the idea that we need to keep government small. And this is what Packwood said. This is a quote. The one reason we do not have any significant demand for national health insurance in this country among those who are employed is because their employers are paying for their benefits. I hate to see us nibble at it for fear you are going to have the demand that the federal government take over and provide these benefits that would otherwise be lost, unquote. What Packwood is suggesting in this quotation is that a key benefit to employer-provided health care is that it has stifled the demand for national health care in this country. Because as long as people could look to their employers to provide it, they had no reason to demand that government provide it. What are the implications? And this is really where I got off on this, and where I really made up my mind that this was a program, this was an issue that we really needed to address here at the Virtual Center. What are the implications of this? The implications, it seems to me, are that this gives conservatives the best of both worlds. It allows them to blunt the demand for national health care. And at the same time, it makes it possible for conservatives to defend the idea of small government. Obviously, if government is making employer-provided health care tax-free, then government is playing a major role in health care. But it's an invisible role. We don't see it. The employer gets all the benefits out of it. In other words, whenever the issue of health care comes up, the employee will credit his employer and say, oh, my boss, that's part of my job. Comes with my job. No mention of government. No mention of government involvement in this. No mention of public money, because there really isn't any direct expense of public money. What is involved is the absence of tax income coming from companies to the government. In other words, this is tax-free. Well, if you go back, and this particular article in the New York Times does this, the author of this is Eduardo Porter, and this goes back into World War II, into the 1940s, into the early 40s. And some of us will remember that the National War Labor Board in 1942 allowed employers to hire employees. Employees were scarce because obviously the military demands of people being drafted were huge. And so many companies were finding it difficult to find employees, qualified, skilled employees. And one of the things that inhibited them from getting good employees was not only the war, but it was the price controls that were put on in order to process the war. As part of the price controls, salaries were frozen. You couldn't offer an employee more money in order to get them to come to work for you. But healthcare answered that question, because employers were given the opportunity by the National War Labor Board to get around price controls by offering healthcare fringe benefits as part of the employment package. And that made it possible for companies to make good hires during World War II. The next year, in 1943, the IRS made employers even more popular by allowing employers to contribute to health care plans tax-free. The point is here, government is making a major commitment to health care, but it's an invisible commitment. And it's not an accident. Because people in this society, we have been told forever and ever and ever that big government and individual freedom don't go together. It's like oil and water. They don't mix. And the only way that people can maintain their freedom is to keep government small. And the only way to continually make that argument and give it any credibility at all is to render government's role in all of this invisible. This is the submerged state that Suzanne Mettler wrote about in her book, which was published in 2006. It is a strategy. And one of the things that Eduardo Porter, in his March 31st piece, his review of Suzanne Mettler's book, in that book, he cites a quote from Dick Morris. And many of you will remember Dick Morris. He was an advisor to President Clinton. He was President Bill Clinton's campaign advisor. And, of course, many of us will remember that he turned on President Clinton in recent elections, and he's become a Fox News regular during election time. He totally fell out with the Clintons and the Clinton administration. But at the time, in the 90s, when he was campaign advisor to President Clinton, he defended tax benefits against Clinton's advisors in the White House. Dick Morris alone stood up for the idea of tax benefits. And this is what he said. Politically, people want us to downsize government. So we're developing ways of cutting taxes, but achieving social good at the same time. In other words, what you're doing is you are hiding government's role in providing assistance to citizens in this society, which makes it possible to continue to defend this idea of small government and the myth of individual freedom as being jeopardized by a too active government. But there's an even bigger issue that it seems to me makes this issue worth addressing. By driving government aid, government assistance through the tax code rather than direct assistance. If government aid was direct, if government was providing health care to everybody in universal health care, if government was loaning money to people to go to college, as they were on during the GI Bill and in Pell Grants, you would get this counter reaction on the part of conservatives who would argue that we're becoming socialist, that government's too visible, government's too big, government's playing too big a role. And the last thing we want to see in this country is direct assistance from government to citizens. Every time I say this, I'm struck during the Depression in 1929 by Herbert Hoover's action as president in vetoing a bill to provide assistance during the Depression to farmers. His concern was that if government begins to provide direct assistance to farmers, farmers will become dependent on government largesse, government aid. The bill was gone back to committee and revised and came up again and ended up on the president's desk again. This time it was government aid to provide food for farm animals. And Hoover gladly signed it. Obviously, New Deal critics, what were to become New Deal critics in the 1930s, were all over President Hoover for this and attacking him in the media for saying he vetoes aid for people, but is more than willing to give aid to chickens and cows and hens and all the rest of it. Hoover's justification? If you keep the animals alive, the farmer will make it. But if you provide direct assistance to the farmer, the animals don't have a chance. The farmer will become so dependent on government aid that he'll stop working, he'll stop trying. That's in effect what's happening here. By channeling government assistance in various elements within the economy into the tax code, you make government's role less visible. You make it possible for people in surveys to say, oh, I don't agree with all these government programs. I don't think government ought to give food stamps and welfare and all this. I don't believe in all these government programs. I think people ought to have to go work for themselves and take care of themselves and all of that. And then you follow up those survey questions with questions like, do you or anybody in your family, does that you or anyone in your family collect Social Security? Or did you go to college on any kind of Pell Grant or anything like that? One of the things that I think all of us remember from some time ago was the guy that stood up during the discussion on health care and said the one thing, he was at a town meeting and said, the one thing I know is I don't want the government messing with my Medicare. The fact of the matter is, obviously, Medicare comes from the government. But people don't recognize that, especially since Medicare is a retirement. Medicare is part of a retirement package that comes out of the New Deal. And people pay into it. People pay into unemployment. People pay into their retirement. And that was Roosevelt's idea in the 1930s. If people pay into this, it's not a giveaway. It's not a government giveaway. People earned it. They have a right to it. It's theirs. And there was one very famous statement where Roosevelt said, this is going to keep people from messing around with Social Security, because people pay into Social Security all the years they work. Therefore, it's not charity. It's not the public dole. It's a retirement program, in part. This is the issue. This is what Suzanne Mettler wrote her book, The Submerged State, about. And she points out that so much possible for people to believe that they're operating free of and independent from government, when in fact much of what they take for granted is either indirect or directly from the government. And the example that everybody Are you there, Bob?
I am indeed, Bill. We had a brief interruption there.
Okay, are we on?
Yes.
Okay, great. Thank you. Let me so we had a technical interruption there, and I'm sorry. What I was basically suggesting is the tax.
Yeah, please continue, Bill.
Okay, thank you, Bob. I apologize to those listening.
Well, we're having some technical work done here outside.
Okay, that's what it is.
Yeah, the internet's coming in and out.
Thank you, Bob.
Sure thing.
So basically, if you talk about tampering with people's mortgage tax deduction, they get really antsy. But the fact of it is that the mortgage tax benefit benefits the wealthy a lot more than it does the average citizen. I think it's very interesting to note the research, and Susan Mettler makes this research available. And what she points out, for example, the top 20% of taxpayers, income taxpayers, the top 20%, the highest 20% of the incomes reap more than 50% of the mortgage tax benefits from IRS. More than half the money that doesn't come to the government because people are able to deduct mortgages from their taxes goes to affects or benefits the top 20% of taxpayers. But the brilliance of this is that because everybody gets a piece of it, however small, everybody is determined to protect it and to defend it. And this is the issue that I think is the most significant of all. By running government assistance through the tax code, that makes it possible to not only continue to promise smaller government, but it makes it possible to hide who's getting the bulk of the benefits from government. In effect, then, this becomes what Susan Mettler calls smoke and mirrors, because it gives the wealthy direct government benefits through the tax code that the vast majority of citizens don't know about or can't take advantage of. But because it's in the tax code, it's invisible. And people don't complain about it because they don't even know it's there. I would suggest that the best evidence of that is the success of H&R Block and some of the other tax agencies that have existed. H&R Block generates tens of millions of dollars in profits because American citizens have no way of knowing how much taxes they owe because the tax code is so complicated. There's no way in the world that the average citizen can take advantage of the tax code when chances are very remote that the average citizen even understands the tax code. But corporations and wealthy individuals are able to hire the legal talent necessary to find all of the opportunities available in the tax code and take advantage of them. So the fact of the matter is, this government provides substantially less direct aid than most of the other developed nations in the world. But if you add the tax benefits, the money that is not received by government because it's tax-free or tax-reduced, if you add that to the direct aid, we are equal to, and in many cases superior to, the other developed countries in the world. The problem is that the working poor in this country are suffering. And their only alternative, seemingly, is to request more government assistance, more government direct aid. But wealthy interests are opposing that by claiming that it would violate the principles of small government, which are so necessary to the preservation of individual freedom. It would move us too much in the direction of socialism. It would make people too dependent on government. Therefore, what we must do is reduce the direct aid and the direct assistance that we are providing to citizens. But nowhere is there any suggestion that we should cut into the kind of aid that is being realized by the few in the tax code. I think this is a very, very significant piece in our overall understanding. Most people are demanding, most liberals are demanding increased government spendings for programs, for social programs. The fact of the matter is, what really has to happen is that the whole tax code needs to be exposed, and we really need to redistribute the way we are making aid and assistance available in this country. Once we did that, it would become clear to all of us as to who gets what and who gets how much. And by redistributing that, it's probably entirely likely that we really wouldn't need to substantially increase the cost of government at all. We just need to readdress or redistribute the resources. This is the idea of the so-called submerged state that Suzanne Mettler discovered in her book published in 2006 called The Submerged State. The recent book that she put out on higher education, entitled Degrees of Inequality, is a look at that one industry to suggest the extremes and the danger of this whole process. She points out, for example, in Degrees of Inequality, that private for-profit education in this country is reaping close to 90% of its total revenue from government. These for-profit institutions and trade schools, like Kaplan, the University of Phoenix, the Apollo Group, which owns the University of Phoenix, a $32 billion operation. $32 billion. Upwards of 86% of its total revenue, it's a for-profit company, comes from government. Even more disturbing, her research points out that there's almost no accountability for these for-profits. The tuition is high, the graduation rates are abysmal, the debt that students incur is huge. Why doesn't government do something about this? Everybody's talking about the increased cost of higher education, but here we have this $32 billion industry that's not educating anybody to do anything. And nobody does anything. Why? Mettler argues that it's because they are private. And because they are private, for profit, they fit into the free enterprise mainstream and wheelhouse of those who defend it. And every time a move is made in Congress to render these institutions more accountable, it's usually defeated. Not by one party, but by both parties. The one thing that Mettler shows in Degrees of Inequality, which seemed to me extremely significant, is that support for for-profit education in this country is bipartisan. When people go at these institutions, Democrats and Republicans, the Black Caucus, everybody comes out of the woodwork to defend them because they are private, because they are for-profit, and because any alternative to them would mean bigger government and more government largesse. So even though the money, $32 billion, with some, obviously, exceptions, I'm sure, is going down the proverbial rat hole, The fact of the matter is government is unwilling to do anything about it. And it's destroying the whole idea in this country that higher education is the ticket to opportunity. It's rendering higher education the province of the wealthy. Because these for-profit institutions which cater to the poor are not working. The graduation rates are abysmal. There's no standards. There's no quality of faculty. In other words, if people do graduate, it's something like 24% graduation rates these institutions have. But they don't get jobs. And they clearly don't get jobs that pay enough to pay the tremendous debt they've incurred. So consequently, we are facing a situation, Mettler points out, where 13% of those enrolled in higher education are enrolled in these for-profit institutions. 13% of our higher education student population is enrolled in these for-profit institutions, yet they account for better than 50% of the defaults, the loan defaults. 50%. It is a disgrace. It is wrong. And what keeps wrong from being made right is the ideological commitment, the insanity that we continue to perpetrate here about this idea of small government and the dangers of socialism and all the rest of it. Stanley Cutler showed in the role of the Supreme Court in Charles River Bridge versus Warren Bridge in 1837 that government's role in economic expansion and economic growth is critical. That hasn't changed. But we listen to the Rand Pauls and the screaming about libertarianism. Today we had the announcement of Marco Rubio. Yesterday we had the announcement of Hillary Clinton. There's no question that one of the threats, one of the dangers that Hillary Clinton's campaign faces is the amount of corporate and foreign money coming into the Clinton Foundation. In other words, there's a serious question as to whether, in fact, her election is going to have any meaningful impact on any of the things we've been talking about or not. If you go back to Dick Morris's quote during Bill Clinton's administration in the 90s, it's very clear that they knew then that the nation was operating in a process of smoke and mirrors, to quote Suzanne Mettler. On the one hand, we're screaming small government, the need for small government and the perpetuation of individual freedom. And on the other hand, we're using the tax code to funnel these huge amounts of money in tax breaks to corporations and wealthy people. Basically, we have an educational challenge here. The educational challenge is huge. That's why I think that these are valuable books by Suzanne Mettler. I think Suzanne Mettler is a scholar to be reckoned with, because I think the research that she's doing shows promise of uncovering things that a lot of people in this society don't want uncovered. Therefore, I recommend them highly. We are at 58 minutes after the hour, and it's time to call it a day here at the Virtual Center. Let me remind you that we will not be back live tomorrow or Wednesday or next Monday. And so our next time together, live here at the Virtual Center, will be a week from tomorrow, Tuesday. I believe that Tuesday is the 22nd of the month, 22nd of April. This is Bill O'Brien. I encourage you to do everything that you can do to support the Virtual Center, more importantly, to support the Head On Radio Network. I know many of you already know about the PayPal button on the homepage for the Head On Radio Network. I encourage you to visit it and use it as you are able, because I think it's very, very important. I think some of the substance and the content that we look at here at the Virtual Center, some of the issues that Bob and his folks discuss in the evening, are issues that would not be discussed were it not for the Head On Radio Network. So again, thank you for tuning in. Thank you for the support, your continued support of the Virtual Center. Be safe. Take care of yourself. Keep thinking. And invite your friends to join us at the Virtual Center when we go back live next Tuesday. The more support, the more listeners, the more participants we have, it seems to me the more vital our message becomes. Thank you so very, very much. I really appreciate your trust. Good day.